Creative profiteers, creative slavery profiteers. During the off seasons, and when a slave owner during the off seasons, and or when a slave owner had more labor force than work, he would rent out slave crews on a mobile basis to surrounding farms. According to According to several historians, it was quite a common sight to see large slave gangs moving on the roads early in the morning or late in the evenings between plantations or farms. These slave gangs were often rented to other planters or to local factory operators. Fair minded slaveholders would even allow slaves to contract out their services in day labor and retain a portion of their own earnings. The few slaves fortunate enough to have such masters were often able to save enough to eventually purchase their own freedom. Other smaller businessmen earned sizable incomes by auctioning or breeding slaves. Auctioneers established offices in major slave entry points and seaport towns such as Charleston, Norfolk, 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 and Baltimore. The typical auction fee was a commission of 2.5% of the total sale cost of each slave. If we assume that each of the 5 million slaves was sold at least once, then a 2.5% auctioneer's commission paid on the average price per slave of $1,000 would have produced a $1 billion industry. After the United States banned slave trading in 1808, the top prices of prime slaves gradually rose as high as $1,800. Slave traders and investors sought alternative ways of meeting the nation's growing demand for slaves. Between 1810 and 1864, a larger commercially profitable domestic slave trading industry was established between old slave states and the newer states entering the Union. Slave breeding emerged as a profitable industry. In 1810, a full one-third of the profits of plantation owners in older regions of the South resulted from breeding slaves for sale in the interstate slave trade. White males used their power to manipulate the sexuality of black males for economic gain. They used them to breed with their own slaves or lease them out for stud service. Most large plantations had a stable of black slaves to perform stud services, which brought in money from neighboring farms. Every newborn black baby represented hundreds of dollars in capital gain to the slaveholder. Black studs, like prize bulls, brought the top dollar in slave trading. Similarly, black females were advertised and sold for their reproductive potential, especially teenage females. Even older black females had higher value if they had successfully given birth to a child. According to one commentator, a fair price for a healthy 30-year-old Negro woman with a child was one fourth more than that of a non breeding woman. Blacks and Indians denied access to gold. In a financial sense, black slaves had the Midas touch. Their labor in Virginia's tobacco fields created the first gold rush. Their labor in cotton created a second gold rush in the fields of the East and Midwest. As a result of the war with Mexico over Texas and slavery, California was acquired from Mexico through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Also, almost immediately afterwards, in 1849, a natural resource, gold, was discovered in California. This discovery of gold ignited a massive influx of wealth seekers from around the world. Within 4 years of the big discovery, more than $200 million worth of gold had reportedly been extracted. National race-based economic preferences and immigration policies emerged and were adopted in the California goldfields. The two groups who had contributed the most towards the building of the new nation, Indians with their land and blacks with their labor, were systematically excluded from participating in the gold rush. In an effort to keep the California gold rush a white only treasure hunt, public pronouncements made it clear to free blacks and Indians that if they wanted to pan gold, they could only do it as a slave to a white person. The hundreds of free blacks who traveled to California in search of gold, not re-enslavement. The hundreds of free blacks who traveled to California in search of gold, not re-enslavement. Okay, traveled to California in search of gold, not re-enslavement, were blocked by local laws and white vigilante violence. California was one of the few free states, so blacks forced out of the gold fields had few other places to go. Most starved to death, were lynched, or died from exposure. The few who survived were forced to inhabit the worst parts of the town and lived commonly in filth and degradation. Like blacks, Indians fared badly. In 1845, 4 years before the gold rush started, approximately 150,000 Indians lived in California. After the gold rush ended, barely 35,000 Indians remained. The intentional exclusion of blacks and Indians from acquiring wealth, or a part of the American dream, had been established into national policy in 1836 by Secretary of War Lewis Cass, who rationalized, "We are all striving in the career of life to acquire riches of honor, power, and some other object, whose possession is to realize the daydreams of our imaginations, and the aggregate of these efforts constitute the advance of society." But there is little of this in the constitution of our savages. But not all non-white groups experience such systematic and exclusionary treatment. As word of the gold rush spread, large waves of South European, Chinese, and Mexican immigrants sought their fortunes in California. Whites considered Chinese more acceptable than Indians or blacks. Accordingly, state and federal government officials praised them as hardworking and thrifty. The Chinese were accepted into the ranks of the gold seekers. Some staked claims and even found a little gold. Others worked in mining camps doing odd jobs, but most Chinese failed to find gold and had little choice but to open ethnic businesses or offer their labor at low wages. Similarly, Mexicans had greater access to the gold fields than either blacks or Indians. The greater acceptance of Mexicans could have resulted from the Spanish culture that was prominent in California, or from the fact that Mexicans had not been categorically and historically abused by white society, although Mexicans ranked lower than Chinese in preferred skin color. In the early 1850s, the number of Mexicans was less than 3,000 in the entire nation. Therefore, they had not they did not present either a challenge or threat to whites, as did the more than 5 million blacks. Though Chinese and Mexicans were non white, they supported European whites' practice of excluding blacks and Indians from prospecting for gold. A minister a minister for this period reportedly observed that the immigrants became the bitterest of Negro haters within 15 days of their naturalization as American citizens. Apparently, learning to despise blacks was an important aspect in the acculturation of immigrants. Blacks carried a heavy burden. They were the target of everyone's hostilities, but were totally unable to defend themselves or compete. Neither Chinese nor Mexicans endured the kind of discrimination that blacks did. Only blacks were the systematic victims of cultural customs and laws that denied them legal freedom, the fruits of their labor, the right of property ownership, the right to protect their person, family, and race, and a promising future. Many social scientists and politicians justify their near total exclusion of free blacks from any land ownership and wealth building activity on the basis that the U.S. Constitution declared them non-citizens and subhuman. But such reasoning does not hold, especially since there was a constant influx of English European, Hispanic, and Asian immigrants who were neither citizens nor Anglo-Saxon Protestants. If free blacks were ineligible to own land, why did government encourage them to participate in every military conflict with a promise of land and other veterans benefits at war's end? Black vets denied access to preferential wealth. Many years later, the American government played another role in preferential wealth distributed to whites. The government passed wealth to its white veterans, both the living and the dead. Through the years, America has expressed its gratitude to its war veterans in a variety of ways, primarily through land grants, land bounties, and homesteading opportunities. In 1642, this same year, in 1642, the same year that Massachusetts introduced slavery into the colonies, Virginia enacted a law forcing blacks to join a militia and protect the larger white society. In 1763, Virginia became one of the first of the colonies to set aside a large section of territory west of the Alleghenies as bounty for veterans. Later, in the 19th century, a veterans land program was established by the federal government to recognize and reward servicemen who had served in wars from the Revolutionary to the Spanish-American War with Mexico. Blacks have participated to varying degrees in nearly every war in which this country has engaged since the year 1619. Yet blacks have received little monetary compensation of any form for their military services to this nation. The Veterans Land Program offered veterans either a homestead site or 6 feet for a burial site. Or 6 feet for a burial site. Since blacks were the only non-English racial or ethnic group that had fought in every major military involvement since the initial settlement in 1619, they were optimistic that perhaps they would be included in the Veterans Land Program. However, black veterans did not qualify for the homesteading sites. Until the 1960s, black veterans fortunate enough to be eligible for free 6-foot burial site were discriminated against even in death. Preferential treatment at most cemeteries and grave sites enforced a whites only rule. Affirmative action for special interest groups. After the Civil War, when nearly all of the land and wealth building resources had been claimed by members of the majority white society, conservative social forces began campaigns against any governmental program or policy that portended assistance or redistribution of wealth to blacks. Convinced that the majority white society was well in possession or control of wealth, power, and resources, conservatives promoted an ideology that the right people were already aboard the wealth boat. So keep the gangplank up. In 1860, 5% of the population controlled approximately 25% of the country's wealth. 130 years later, after a civil war, 2 world wars, a major economic depression, and a civil rights movement, the major possessors of wealth remain unchanged. 5% of the American population still controls 25% of the country's total wealth. Most of this wealth was passed on from generation to generation. The younger generations of whites resent being held morally or financially responsible for the racial sins of their ancestors, though as whites, they still enjoy the inherited advantages and privileges of slavery. Ironically, most wealthy conservatives today pretend that they earned their wealth rather than admit that they got it the old-fashioned way through preferential government treatment, exploitation of black labor, expropriation of Indian land, or simply as an inheritance from those who acquired it through one or any combination of those three ways. Conservative elements oppose reparations or any government programs that benefits blacks, but few acknowledge the existence of or oppose systemic government programs that distribute wealth to various special interest groups within the majority white society. Despite current political rhetoric, blacks are not the primary recipients of federal grants, giveaways, and subsidies. Historically, the largest recipients of federal government largesse have been railroads, ranchers, farmers, and miners. Theoretically, public lands and resources within the United States are owned by or held in trust for all citizens. Accordingly, the federal government should manage these properties in a way that benefits all Americans. However, the government has not managed public properties in an even handed manner in the best interest of all the people. The federal government has systematically permitted a select wealthy population to use, exploit, and profit from these public resources. These programs frequently never required recipients to pay anything, and when payment was required, the payment never approached the fair market value for the public service resources, rather. As such, these programs amount to massive taxpayer-funded subsidies to the recipients. Due to the racial policies and feelings within the nation at the time these grants were made, the benefits were doled out along racial lines. These programs, some of which continue to this day, can therefore be considered race-based government preferences for whites even now. But somehow, Americans have never allowed themselves to think this way. The term preferential treatment only applies when federal programs are targeted to provide assistance to disfavored groups. Meanwhile, preferential government programs that benefit the majority group are simply seen as either maintaining the status quo or as temporary assistance to a vital segment of the population in the interest of national security. Majority preference programs are so pervasive and so accepted that it is almost a radical notion to term it white affirmative action. Yet, if we apply the definition equally, this is clearly what these programs are. The following section discusses some affirmative programs for whites. Perfect timing. All right, let's see, timeline, 1857 to 1867. 1857, U.S. Supreme Court used Dred Scott decision. 1859, John Brown raided military armory at Harper's Ferry. 1862, sharecropping system. 1862, sharecropping system began. Congress enacted Homestead Act for free land. 1862. 1863, Lincoln signed Emancipation Proclamation. 1865, 14th 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments enacted. 1866. Andrew Jackson vetoed 40 acres and a mule for freed black slaves. Mother skipper. Let's see. Southern states, 1867. Southern states enacted black codes, 1867. Emancipation Proclamation. And waste no time. 13, 14, 15 minutes. Andale, please. Okay. Okay, we gotta go. Weirdness. How?
Hi, my name is Trabal, and I want us to aspire for more meaning, more understanding.
Why is that on?
Hi, my name is Trabal, and I want us to aspire for more meaning.
Blah, 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 blah. Know what that means. I don't know how that happened.
More understanding. We need more meaning in our thoughts, speech, and actions. We need more understanding about ourselves, other people, and our physical and spiritual.
I don't know how that happened. All right, cool.